I just find this to be kind of like a sinister pedantry in the sense that October 7th just happened. The country is in shock and rage, and they don't want to allow food and electricity. They decided that they wanted to do this. I think it was a poor decision in the sense that I don't think it was sustainable. But on the other hand, this is like a tactic that one would say, okay, fine, no food until you give us back our hostages. I don't think that was going to work. I think it's completely understandable in those first 2 weeks to say that we're going to close our border until we get our people back.
What's relevant is the intent. It corresponds to this period of blocking all food from coming in. They're also bombing Gaza at the same time and killing more civilians than have died in any month of bombing in the 21st century. And it shows murderous intention. This is how we operate in the law. We look at intention, even if the intention doesn't lead to tangible consequences.
The UN agency that measures famine said there hasn't been a famine.
You're jumping from one issue to another. I'm talking about murderous intentions that we have evidence of in the context of this starvation strategy the first 2 weeks.
Yes, after you are attacked in a vicious and horrible way,
the
you country that you attacked is going to have murderous intentions against the people that just attacked you. Why is that like a difficult concept?
Hello, everybody. This is Glenn Loury. You've tuned into The Glenn Show. I'm with John McWhorter, my regular conversation partner every other week. We talk at The Glenn Show. He's a professor at Columbia University, and he writes a column for the New York Times. I'm a professor at Brown University and a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. John and I are joined this week by Eli Lake and by Matthew Cockrell. Eli Lake is an American journalist and podcaster. He's former senior national security correspondent at the Daily Beast and at Newsweek, and a former columnist for Bloomberg. And he writes about national security and other matters and hosts the Breaking History podcast.
Which will launch on January 22nd.
Say that again, Eli?
It launches on January 22nd with the Free Press.
We'll be launching on coming soon.
Yes.
Breaking History podcast for the Free Press. And Matthew Cockrell is a PhD student in history at the London School of Economics who also runs a modest social media platform that he calls History Speaks. He's a longtime reader and listener and subscriber to both Glenn Loury and John McWhorter, and his role in peer reviewing an important study by an organization called Air Wars, which has assessed the extent of civilian casualties in aerial conflict throughout the Middle East, but especially in Gaza in the first month of the war. He has brought to our attention. We decided it would be good to have a spirited discussion about that here. Let me just say that Air Wars is a London-based non-for-profit company that tracks and archives the international air war against Islamic State and other groups in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and assesses and follows credible allegations of civilian casualties from coalition, Russian, Turkish, Israeli, and domestic Libya airstrikes. I'm just reading from their boilerplate. Air Wars was founded by investigative journalist Chris Woods in late 2014. So that's the cast of characters, and the agenda is a discussion, especially now in light of talk about a ceasefire, of the extent of civilian casualties and the character of the aerial bombardment of the Gaza population by the Israel Defense Forces. And Matthew, who, as I mentioned, served as a peer reviewer for the Air Wars study of the Gaza conflict, is going to tell us a little bit about that study and his general takeaways from it. Matthew?
Yeah, so just a quick addendum. I did review the study early, as you say, but I would not take any substantive credit for shaping it and so forth, and I don't want to have the folks at Air Wars be responsible for any polemical thing I tweet or say on this podcast. So just one footnote.
Oh, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't do a polemical thing.
Oh no, never, absolutely. Eli wouldn't either. So we're both gentlemen above polemics. In terms of the study, what it reveals is shocking, and what it reveals is corroborative of what we know from other sources, of a convergence of evidence about the nature of the bombing campaign in October 2023. This was the bloodiest bombing campaign for a month of bombing in the 21st century by far, shattering records of women killed, children killed, and civilians killed in the 21st century. Obviously, you can find worse cases in the 20th without much difficulty, but the 21st century. In terms of some comparisons, the number of women killed in this 25-day period of bombing by Israel was nearly 7 times as great as the number of women killed by the United States in Raqqa and Mosul combined. Entire wars, we're talking about well over a year of bombardment. The number of children killed is approximately equal to the number of children killed by all foreign actors. So we're excluding Assad, but we're talking about Russia, United States, foreign terrorist groups, and so on, in the bloodiest year of the Syrian civil war for children. And another important element of this is that the overwhelming majority of deaths are caused by bombing non-militarized homes. So the one thing the Israelis like to say, and they're correct, is that Hamas embeds among civilian groups insofar as they militarize civilian infrastructure, and this creates risks to civilians, right? But in October 2023, the overwhelming majority of civilian casualties, over 90% of the women and children killed, were killed by bombing non-militarized homes. And what Israel appears to have been doing, and we know this from other reporting in The Guardian and 972 magazine, is enacting a program called Where's Daddy, where if one Hamasnik, a guy who was in Hamas or was demobilized for whatever reason, he went home to sleep, right? Israel would, through an AI program with the name Where's Daddy, it would trigger a bombing. And they would bomb the home, and entire multi-generational families would be liquidated. This happened over and over again. On average, to cite one of the shocking statistics, which again attests to this program, the Where's Daddy program, when one civilian was killed, on average, 14 members of his family were killed with him in October 2023. Moreover, I think it's even dubious that, and the Air Wars report supports this, and also the New York Times report supports this, how many of these people were actually Hamasniks that they were targeting, right? I think their AI program was very glib. I think they were going very fast. They wanted to respond in a big way to October 7th. And the final result was reckless indifference to civilian life, and also reckless targeting practices insofar as they weren't even sure these people were in Hamas, that they were bombing to death in their homes with their families. And in the final analysis, this is my interpretation, not Air Wars, the bombing was of such a lethal character, again, shattering all 21st century records for civilians killed, women killed, children killed, that this actually amounted to murder under the laws of war. And what I mean by that is not necessarily, although I think this is true, frankly, not necessarily that Israel wanted to kill civilians, that there was a goal to kill civilians for punitive reasons or whatever in October 2023, but that they were showing what is called reckless disregard for civilian life. So they were just glibly liquidating these multi-generational families, bombing these homes with weak evidence of combatant status for this one person. And this amounts, even if you don't want to kill civilians, under the laws of war, if you show reckless disregard, it's not that you're not trying enough, you're just barely trying at all. This amounts to murder under the laws of war. And this is a serious disgrace for the Western world and for Western intellectuals. Present company excluded in terms of Glenn, at least. I don't know your views, John, and I know, so I guess included for you, Eli, that we would condone this. And I think, again, we'll talk about this more, but there's all kinds of other evidence in addition to this study in terms of Israeli public opinion, in terms of murderous intentions regarding starvation in the early parts of the war by Israeli leadership that corroborates a policy of effectively murder in at least the early part of the war. I don't think we can say that for the war as a whole.
Well, if I could respond.
Of course, I was going to try to fashion a question to invite you to respond, but
you want to fashion the question? That's fine too.
Inconsistent with the laws of war, amounts to murder, reckless disregard, unnecessary for military objectives, not reflective of human shield arguments. That's what I took from that.
Okay, well, first of all, I think that we should stipulate that the law of armed conflict determines this question of reckless disregard based on the military objective. So if you look at the New York Times story that was about how Israel loosened its criteria for targeting so that you would allow for more civilian casualties for an individual strike per day after October 7th, that to me is unremarkable because before October 7th, Israel was conducting what you might call low-level counterterrorism campaigns where they were not fighting an existential war after October 7th. Needless to say, I don't need to make the emotional appeal. Clearly, in those days and weeks following this horrific kind of murder spree and abduction strategy, and after Hamas starts the war, the objectives of the war change to the eradication of Hamas. And so the value of lower level commanders becomes much greater. And that is, I think, the correct analysis for the legal point about the law of armed conflict. One of the things that Matthew did not mention is that even though Israel no longer did what are called these roof knocks as often as they did before in other conflicts with Gaza, they still had plenty of efforts to warn Gazans about getting out of certain areas. There were phone calls, there were there were routes that were publicized to tell civilians to leave. It is unclear why lots of civilians didn't leave. And this is a point I'm going to be kind of returning to here, is that there's a lot of fog of war because, in my side, the pro-Israel side might argue, well, Hamas didn't allow for certain civilians to leave. There's some anecdotal evidence to that, but there's just a lot of, so that's another part of it. The second thing is that the Air Wars analysis did not account for, when they say what is a military target, what was underneath the military targets, which we now know is more than 300 miles of tunnels that Hamas built, it seems expressly for a future war that they started on October 7th, meaning that this is a place where, Hamas's fighters were allowed, the Gaza civilians were not allowed. This was a place where many of the hostages were taken. And this was a kind of like city underneath a city that was part of, I think, what is Hamas's strategy, which is so sinister in that it is both to kill as many Jews as they can and to allow their adversaries after starting a war to try to kill as many Palestinian civilians. And I think that the fact that so much of Hamas's actual infrastructure, whether it's the rocket launchers, whether it's the ammo storage or the tunnels that are underneath all of these very densely populated areas, is testament to that particular strategy. And finally, I would just say that the claim that this is the deadliest war, I mean, there are certain blind spots, I think, in the air wars comparison. For example, they have analyzed Russian bombing campaigns in the Syrian war. But as I checked, and correct me if I'm wrong, Matthew, have they also analyzed the use of the barrel bombs and chlorine bombs that Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian Air Force dropped?
No. They did not analyze. It was all foreign actors in Syria.
Okay.
So it would
So that
exclude
seems a little bit
Assad.
of so that seems to me to be a little bit of a curious, or at least an omission, that if you're going to say it's the deadliest campaign and you're not going to count these horrible barrel bombs and chlorine bombs. Another example is
To be clear, that's my claim regarding the 21st century, but Air Wars has not specifically analyzed.
Well, I think
Assad,
Air
but go
Wars
ahead.
said something like, all right, fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would argue that the Assad campaign against his own civilians was worse and deadlier, and we know that from the bigger death tolls. And I would also say that while they have analyzed Russian campaigns against Ukraine in some areas, there are certain really deadly battles that I haven't seen air war studies on, such as Mariupol, where the low estimate is that I think 11,000 were killed in the campaign in 2022. So I'm somewhat skeptical of this as the worst, deadliest of the 21st century. And by saying it's the 21st century, we're leaving out a lot of things that happened, at the later part of the 20th century, from the Vietnam War to the first Gulf War, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another critique. And then, I mean, I would like to kind of hear your argument about the intentionality, because it gets to this, what I think is a slander, which is the idea that Israel has committed a genocide here. But before we get into the sort of statements of Israeli officials and so forth, and we should let's do that in a second. The final thing I would say is that Israel is, after again, terrorist group steals its citizens, murders its citizens. In the aftermath, I think the country is in kind of a PTSD. It changed the rules of engagement because it felt that it had to eradicate Hamas. And that's why you saw that bloody campaign. And it's fighting an enemy with no insignia. It's fighting an enemy that has a strategy of deliberately embedding itself with the civilian population, which I'm glad you acknowledged. And it's fighting an enemy that I think as part of its strategy, part of its messaging strategy in particular, seeks the death of civilians on its own side. So those are extraordinary and I think I would say unique circumstances that Israel is facing. And that is why you saw the ferocity of those first 5 or 6 weeks, where I acknowledge lots of civilians were killed. And that is always a tragedy in war. But I think that it's one-sided to say that that is entirely the fault of Israel and its response to the worst mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust.
Well, here we are in the first week of a new presidential administration. You know that every development, every move in this very contentious time will be woven into different contradictory narratives presented to you by the competing sides. It's never been more important to have the right tools to uncover bias, break free from big tech algorithms, and escape echo chambers. That's where Ground News comes in. It's the website and app I rely on daily to stay informed, to cut through the noise, and to get closer to the truth. Visit ground.news/Glenn Show to see for yourself how it works. My favorite feature of Ground News is the blind spot feed. It shows you stories that are disproportionately reported by either the left or the right. I find it really helpful for gaining a balanced perspective in our hyper-polarized world. To show you what I mean, here's a story that's ignored by left-leaning outlets. Hundreds of immigrants arrested on first day of ICE raid. Trump border czar says. And here's one that's mostly reported by the left with almost no coverage on the right. Federal employees are told to name colleagues who work in DEI roles or risk adverse consequences. For both of these stories and for every story, Ground News gives you a breakdown of the sources covering it, the bias of the media outlets reporting across the left, center, and right, how reliable these sources have been in the past, and who owns them. This is the kind of news analysis you won't find anywhere else. Right now, my viewers can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan, which is the same plan I use. Make sure you subscribe using my link at ground.news/Glenn Show, or click the link in the description, or scan the QR code when signing up. That's ground.news/Glenn Show.
Yeah, so I'll just make a couple of responses. So obviously, Hamas embeds among civilians. What I reject, and I think the evidence for this given is very flimsy, it's quotes where like Sinwar is saying, oh, the sacrifice of the civilians is worth it. Well, you can find quotes from allied military leaders talking about the sacrifice of our soldiers is worth it. It doesn't mean there was a conspiracy to kill, for allied military leaders to kill US soldiers in the Second World War. The strategy Hamas uses definitely endangers civilians and is a war crime, right? The embedding. I don't buy the claim that there's some conspiracy by them to try to kill civilians to discredit Israel politically. I think they're doing what the Viet Cong did. They can't fight Israel head on, and they are embedding among civilians, embedding in civilian infrastructure to facilitate guerrilla warfare, to make guerrilla warfare more effective. It endangers their civilians. It's wrong. I think the claims of a conspiracy to kill their civilians are fanciful. And incidentally, one of the reasons...
I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it's a strategy.
No, I disagree. I don't think that's what they're doing.
You don't think that starting a war, violating a ceasefire on October 7th, and then hiding in tunnels underneath your civilian infrastructure is not evidence of a strategy to endanger your own civilians?
Okay.
Of course it is.
So you're talking about, I think the effect is to endanger your civilians when you embed. I don't think the goal is let's kill civilians to discredit Israel. I think the goal is doing what the Viet Cong did.
Okay, they're the sovereigns of Gaza. Okay.
I'm not saying they're not responsible. It's clear the distinctions I'm drawing, I think.
Okay.
They are responsible. It's a war crime. There isn't a conspiracy to kill their own civilians. Their own civilians are mad at them right now. If you look at polling data and anecdotally, you talk to people in Gaza, as I do, they're mad at Hamas because of the civilian casualties. So Hamas has a political incentive not to kill as many Gazans as possible because then they'll lose political power. So why are they doing this? If this isn't a conspiracy to kill Gazans, it's because if they fought the IDF head on, they have no air force, they're militants in sandals, right? They would be destroyed in 5 minutes. So they have to use guerrilla warfare methods from their perspective, and they endanger civilians in the process. I'm not condoning it, but I think the claim of a conspiracy to kill their civilians is rather fanciful. The
Okay, I
second
mean,
point is
I would reiterate that unless you think that that Yawa Sinwar, Muhammad Daif, rest in pieces, are just stunningly unaware and ignorant, then how would they not know that after the kind of brutality unleashed on a peace concert and Keep It Seam, burning families alive in safe rooms, there would not be this kind of response from the country they just attacked. I mean, and then again, like I don't think it's a
yeah, but
conspiracy. I think it's just a clear.
there's a
You talk about
difference.
reckless endangerment. That is the definition right there.
Well, yeah, but we're not debating whether Hamas has committed murder on October 7th. That's not a serious discussion, whether they did or not. Obviously, they did. The
I think Eli meant reckless endangerment of Palestinians.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I think that's a bit of a stretch in terms of the mens rea. You can make arguments. Their criminality is not in dispute. Their murderous nature is not in dispute. What I'm saying is that I don't accept the claim of a conspiracy by Hamas to maximize civilian deaths on their side. What I do accept is that they are willing to endanger their civilians to achieve other goals, right? They're willing to put their civilians in harm's way to conduct guerrilla warfare the way they do. The analogy I'd use is a Viet Cong. Now, moving aside from that, the human shields claim, though, again, we're talking about claims that are true sometimes, right? Of they've militarized this school, they've militarized this hospital. They're waging war out of civilian infrastructure. And then Israel has to bomb and we kill, and Israel, from their perspective, we kill civilians. It's a tragic. If we go again back to October 2023, there is not a human shield scenario unless you say a Hamas guy living with their family in a non-militarized home is human shielding, which is preposterous, right? We'll see what the international courts think of that. They were killing people overwhelmingly by bombing non-militarized homes in this program called Where's Daddy, in a political climate where all the polling data, the statements from Israeli leaders,
on Where's Daddy,
indicate that a very high level of dehumanization of the Gazan civilian population.
On Where's Daddy, I'm skeptical of 972's reporting, just based on having followed their work before, and the Guardian's reporting on it. I do note that there was a reference to an AI program in the New York Times, which was very different than what was described in 972. Their program seems to be working from cell phone calls and geolocations and things like that of senior commanders. Again, there was a decision that was made. And by the way, I'm open to the idea that it was with the luxury of geographic and temporal distance, that we can go back and criticize that. I just don't think that you can look at that situation that Israel was in at the time. They said, all right, before we would not have targeted a senior Hamas commander when we were not at an existential war with Hamas. Now we are in an existential war with Hamas, and we were willing to do that. That seems pretty straightforward to me.
Just to be clear, the New York Times piece, really quickly, Eli, I'll let you finish.
Yeah.
The New York Times piece says that 20 civilians in October 2023, that you could kill 20 civilians to kill one junior Hamasnik. So just a guy who just had signed up for their military.
Because the situation had changed dramatically to, you were now in an existential war and you have to eliminate Hamas. And if this is what your adversary who doesn't wear uniforms does, then they are willing to do that. It's ugly. That's why war is horrendous. But that's what happened. I don't think that that's really, again, I don't think it's particularly remarkable. The only other thing I would just say about the civilian casualties and who was a civilian casualty and so forth is that this is a really knotty, difficult question. And I just want to sort of, as a matter of history, and I know you appreciate this because you have argued eloquently with Holocaust deniers, which I want to just credit you for doing. I did a little bit of research on you. And you and I both know that in World War II, the original estimate that were put out by the Nazis for the bombing of Dresden was that it was something like 400,000 civilians were killed. Because the city of Dresden commissioned, as you know, another audit of all that, we now historians accept that it was somewhere between, I think, 22,000 and maybe 28,000 or something like that. That just goes to show that kind of counting civilian casualties, especially in an urban war environment like this, is very, very tricky business. And I'm not taking anything away from air wars. I appreciate that they are doing the best they can to identify civilians with the best information that they have. But I think you can also say it's a very difficult task. It's hard. They are relying on some cases on, correlating social media posts, interviews that people give. And I guess what I would say is that's a difficult, I don't know if that is particularly correct. I'm not going to make the argument that everybody that was killed in these instances, and I accept the New York Times reporting, was a Hamas member or a militant, because I acknowledge there are civilians who are going to be killed in war. But my point is that I'm not going to necessarily accept that the air wars is the final word on this, just because I just know historically it's really, really difficult to actually discern who is a civilian and who isn't a civilian, especially in a war like this.
Eli, do you think that the Where's Daddy is the way it has to be? Is the Where's Daddy strategy the way it has to be because of the existential crisis? Is that what you're saying?
I don't necessarily know I don't know what the right answer to that is. I mean, there was a debate within the senior IDF ranks and the war cabinet right after October 7th that said, don't launch the invasion or don't launch the war on Gaza, go after Hezbollah, because they started. It's very, very difficult to second guess. I think that you have to look at it in the context of this horrible thing happened. All of the assumptions of Netanyahu, but every Israeli senior leader, that you could live with Hamas controlling a state-led in Gaza that Israel had withdrawn from in 2005, was out the window, and they sort of decided, okay, we have to eliminate Hamas. And I think Hamas kind of knew that was coming, and they, had managed to sort of create an entire military infrastructure that was honeycombed around the civilian infrastructure of Gaza. And something horrible happened in the sense that lots of civilians were killed. But again, they started a war, and that's what happened. I don't know, by the way, that the Where's Daddy, I just want to say, and I haven't done independent reporting on it, so I'm going to tread really lightly. I don't trust the Guardian and 972 on it. I'm sure that they use AI programs. I'm not entirely sure that there is a program called Where's Daddy, and this is what it is.
Okay, so let's let content there.
Okay.
Yeah. Look, the Where's Daddy thing again. I think this just comes down to a problem that a lot of people on your side of this have, which is I think there's an epistemic assumption that we're the good guys, meaning the West and Western aligned state, and we would not commit major atrocities, right? I think there is an assumption.
Well, I'm not under that assumption.
Okay,
I know the history of the Vietnam War. I know about My Lai. I'm not making that assumption. I know that all kinds of people who I might agree with and Western powers commit atrocities. I'm sure Israel commits atrocities. That is not what I'm saying.
Okay, well, let me articulate my point. You can rebut it. I'm saying I'm off the tracks. The convergence of evidence points to this program existing. You have in the air war study, over 90% of the casualties from women and children are on bombing of non-militarized homes. What is bombing of non-militarized homes other than this Where's Daddy program? Unless they are committing, just trying to kill civilians, which I think they probably were targeting Hamas next, presumably. That's corroborative of Where's Daddy, because why else bomb non-militarized homes directly? Then you have the Guardian, then you have 972, you have testimonial evidence from soldiers. This program, there's a fellow I follow who has IDF on Twitter even, who has various IDF sources, Ben Ephraim, I don't know how to pronounce his name, don't know Hebrew, but he has spoken to IDF personnel who corroborate the existence of this program. You have over and over again, all these families, all these families wiped off the registry. Given the overall rate of casualties is not 1 million or 800,000 or whatever, it's a lot lower than that. Just the number of families that have been wiped out, that points to direct bombings of families together, these bombing of non-militarized homes. So the program, the Where's Daddy program existed, and it basically is something that you can't reconcile with the clean war effort by Israel, and it takes away the human shields excuse, because this isn't a case of militarizing civilian infrastructure by Hamas, where you have to kill the civilians to get at
we don't know necessarily that a family home is not also an entrance to a military tunnel. I mean, there's certain things that we have to just accept that we don't know, because Israel hasn't shared all of their information either.
Yeah, but if there's a tunnel, that would be presumably that would be a case.
Well, this kind of gets to a corollary argument that is made by your side often about the power and the weight of the bombs that are used.
Yes.
What the IDF will say is, yes, we had to use heavier bombs or bunker buster bombs because we were, because the entrance to a tunnel was, underneath a home or something like that. So,
yeah,
again, these are, I think if you only wish to say that Israel loosened the rules of engagement to allow for more civilian casualties after October 7th, when they were targeting mid-level or senior commanders, I say yes,
and
they
junior,
did.
and junior, and junior.
Okay, fine. Yes, they did. Because they are in the middle of an existential war to wipe out Hamas after Hamas started a war with a barbaric and horrendous act.
Let me ask you a question, Eli.
Sure.
Because you speak of existential conflict, and there's talk in the air now of ceasefire.
Mm-hmm.
And as I understand it, and I'm not an expert, and I haven't studied carefully the ceasefire proposal, but I'll just say my understanding is that Israel would, as the ceasefire evolves, agree to withdraw from Gaza and would leave Hamas in effective control. Does that not acknowledge the failure of the objective that you have put forward, which is the absolute necessity of eliminating Hamas, and bespeak the futility of Israel's campaign at the end of the day? So if it was an existential threat, how can we live with a ceasefire that allows the threat to be sustained?
Well, it's a great question. I think that from what I understand of the ceasefire right now, that is correct. However, some things have changed from the beginning of the war. First, the original senior leadership of Hamas is wiped out. Second of all, Iran has no air defense systems, which is one of their important sponsors. Hezbollah's senior leadership is wiped out. Bashar al-Assad has fallen in Syria, although I think Israel kind of softened the ground, but it was ultimately Turkey that led to the collapse of that regime. So the region is changing quite a bit, and there may be opportunities, especially depending on what happens, with Iran, which is extremely vulnerable right now. If you can take away its nuclear blackmail, then I do think that maybe there is an opportunity for a better kind of administration to emerge in Gaza, and hopefully, negotiation for a two-state solution at some point, which I don't think is possible as long as Hamas is a kind of significant force. There was a statement from outgoing Secretary of State Antony Blinken that Hamas has been able to replenish its ranks, which I'm not sure I believe, but that's what he said.
I wonder how he knows. He says more. They've recruited more, incrementally more than have been killed in the conflict.
I'm agreeing with you. I don't know how he knows that. And that would certainly sort of be on the futility side of it. Again, I would just say that this axis of Iranian resistance is diminished significantly as a result of Israel's actions. And that I do think we'll see how that plays out. There are sort of much broader dynamics at this point. Perhaps, and again, I'm speculating here, agreeing to the ceasefire, which is, I think, for a lot of reasons, not a very good deal for Israel. But maybe that opens up space for the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, or for that matter, the Palestinian Authority, to feel comfortable to go into Gaza and, set up a more stable administration. That is an optimistic spin. I think that a pessimistic, but also maybe realistic spin might be that all of this war is fought and you're still going to have Hamas in Gaza, and that's a terrible tragedy. So I'm not necessarily going to disagree with that. The ceasefire right now doesn't look good, but there are other factors that we have to sort of wait and see about, and maybe that will change.
John and I often talk about higher education on this podcast, obviously. That's the universe we both inhabit. And why not? It's a topic that has moved front and center of late at both the state and national level. Free speech on campus, viewpoint diversity on campus, cancel culture on campus, soaring tuition, affirmative action, race-based admissions, accreditation, the erosion of standards, attacks on the classics, hiring litmus tests, critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You name it, it's in the news. So, with all that's going on, and there's a lot going on, to whom can one turn as a trusted resource of all issues related to campus reform, whether you're a student, faculty, trustee, administrator, donor, policymaker, or alumni? One source we want you to know about and strongly recommend as a credible and respected voice on all these issues is the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, or ACTA, whom we're pleased to have supporting this episode. ACTA is on the front lines, promoting academic excellence, academic freedom, and accountability at America's colleges and universities. They don't just serve as trusted advisors to college trustees and alumni, they help arm reformers with resources, ideas, recommendations, information, even grassroots alumni support through their Campus Freedom Initiative. They make positive changes happen, and they approach these issues in a nonpartisan, balanced, informed, highly credible way, which we appreciate. If you care deeply about these issues, as John and I do, you really must know more about the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Start by looking them up on the web at goacta.org. That's goacta.org. And follow them on Twitter and Facebook.
Matthew, may I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What is it that leads you to believe that there's been a deliberate quest to kill Palestinians on the part of Israel? And I think we know that there are always going to be some evil soldiers in that sort of, but you're making it sound like it's practically an official policy. What makes you think that?
Yeah. So first I have to qualify what I'm saying a bit. So I'm talking specifically about the early bombing. I think this may have extended beyond that, beyond October 2023, a kind of punitive policy of killing civilians. But I'm talking specifically about October 2023 because that's what I can evidence. And there is evidence that the character of the war in terms of the demographics of the dead, right? Early on, 70% women and children, and then a lot of the men are middle-aged, so it seems like almost all people being killed are civilians, and the demographics change over the course of the war. So the case would be weaker later in the war. But the reason I believe that, John, that Israel, at least early on in the war, was purposefully killing civilians is simply because of clear statements of intent to do so and policies that were being implemented to do so. So in the first 2 weeks of the war, Israel was blocking all aid from coming into Gaza, not just through the Israeli border with Gaza, where there would be security concerns, but also through the Rafah crossing with Egypt.
How did that work?
How did that work? They were blocked. Israel has, through its treaty with Egypt, a level of sovereignty over the Rafah crossing. The goods cannot go through Rafah without Israeli consent.
I want to seriously challenge that, because what we found out in the war is that there was enormous smuggling of weapons and other things into Gaza from Egypt. If Egypt felt that, if Egypt had disagreed, they could have easily allowed for aid to come into Gaza. So I disagree.
Okay, so you may think Egypt agrees. I think that's an unsubstantiated claim. But regardless, you dispute that in the first 2 weeks of the war, supported by statements from Israel and supported by statements from Biden, Blinken, from Bob Woodward's book, that Israel...
I don't disagree. In the first 2 weeks of the war, they said nothing is going to go into Gaza.
Right. Okay, there you go.
That's true. So, for 2 weeks.
Correct. For 2 weeks.
While they were trying to find out where their civilians were, while there were still Hamas fighters on the ground in Israel.
We can excuse
it. They decided to close their border with Gaza. Yeah. I know. It's
no, not their border, not just their border, but also preventing food from coming in through Rafah.
They wanted to... I don't understand why that is a gotcha.
Okay. I don't... look, it's an intention to murder under the laws of war.
No, it's not.
It isn't just... Yes, it is. They're not... Eli, you said on Twitter, this is about they don't want to provide food for them. They're still not providing food for them.
No, I said they don't want to provide food to the army that just invaded them and started a war. I didn't say that. This is like... And yes, lots of Israelis felt the same way after
it. They had a policy of blocking all food from coming into Gaza, of preventing international organizations of the sort that provide aid in war, right?
Do you mean only for 2 or 3 weeks or for longer? Because if it's 2 or 3 weeks, it doesn't...
it does matter. So longer... 2 weeks.
By the way, less. I think it's less than 2 weeks, but okay.
Okay. Here's why it matters.
Mm-hmm.
So even if we say, and I don't think this is true, but even if we say nobody was killed because of these actions,
we know no one was killed because of those actions.
It shows a murderous intent, and this intent, this policy of blocking all food from coming in, using starvation as a weapon, was being implemented while they were bombing Gaza, while this historically bloody campaign was occurring. They wanted to use starvation. We have express statements to this effect. We have Bob Woodward's book. Biden and Blinken talked about this. They wanted to use starvation to get the people of Gaza to identify where the hostages were, or to overthrow Hamas for punitive reasons, to coerce the population en masse. And even if nobody died from this, and we can talk about the later starvation policy, which is much more subtle than this first 2 weeks, it shows an intent to kill. And this intent to kill civilians, corresponded to this bombing of Gaza, where thousands of civilians were killed. So in this period where they have the murderous intent, where we know they have the murderous intent to starve, to block all food from coming in, they are bombing Gaza and killing thousands of civilians. So what I would say, incidentally, in a previous life, I have a JD from U Chicago and so forth, so I do have legal training. They have a mens rea or a murderous intention, and this corresponds to the act of the bloodiest month of bombing, killing civilians in the 21st century, of this bombing non-militarized homes over and over again. So the first 2 weeks of the war are very relevant, even if we think no one died, because it shows Israeli intent, murderous intent, and this murderous intent corresponded with the bloodiest bombing campaign in the history of the 21st century. So that's the big reason. And also, why did they stop it? Why did they stop the starvation plan? Yoav Gallant said on October 20th, the Americans insisted we let food in, and we are not in a place where we can refuse them. We rely on them for planes and military equipment. What are we supposed to do? Tell them no? So it's not as if they had a humanitarian impulse. They were committed to this starvation plan.
No, they didn't have a humanitarian. They were just attacked by vicious Mongolian-style hordes.
Sure,
of course
they didn't justify blocking food from children.
I'm sorry. I just find this to be kind of like a sinister pedantry, in the sense that, this October 7th just happened. The country is in shock and rage, and they don't want to allow food and electricity. And by the way, Gaza gets electricity from other places besides Israel. So, but they decided that they wanted to do this. I think it was a poor decision in the sense that I don't think it was sustainable. But on the other hand, this is like a tactic that one would say, okay, fine, no food until you give us back our hostages. Again, I don't think that was going to work. Okay. And obviously they buckled to pressure from the Biden administration. But since then, the statistics are borne out. I mean, the UN agency, I think it's called IPOC, that looks at famine, they warned of famine and they said there was no famine. I think that even the Gaza Health Ministry says that only 41 people have died of malnutrition since the war started. That is not a policy of starvation. Again, I think it's completely understandable in those first 2 weeks to say that we're going to close our border until we get our people back. And that's what they did.
You keep changing the issue. They want. So it is, what's relevant is the intent, first of all. It corresponds to this period of blocking all food from coming in. They're also bombing Gaza at the same time and killing more civilians than have died in any month of bombing in the 21st century. And it shows murderous intention. This is how we operate in the law. We look at intention, even if the intention doesn't lead to tangible consequences. And in terms of the starvation, look, I don't believe the claims of famine. I do believe that Israel...
Well, they're not true.
Okay, we agree. I do find it interesting that this is the one area where the fog of war doesn't apply, but I think the evidence does not support famine. We have.
Well, okay, fine. The UN agency that measures famine said there hasn't been a famine.
Sure.
Okay.
First of all, I think you're jumping from one issue to another. I'm talking about murderous intentions that we have evidence of in the context of this starvation strategy. First 2 weeks.
Yes. After you are attacked in a vicious and horrible way, the
you
country
that
you attacked is going to have murderous intentions against the people that just attacked you. Why is that like a difficult concept? I mean, and also, I just find it to be like the scrutiny on Israel. There was this 2-week period where, yes, there were some things that were said that were impolitic. But again, we have the luxury of time and geographic distance to sort of to criticize it. In the moment when Yoav Gallant says we're fighting human animals, I don't think
Israel Katz said of the civilian population that they will never receive another drop of water until they leave the earth.
Then he corrected it in that very same press conference. So,
Katz said that?
Katz said, as I understand it, that everybody is culpable, and then he was asked about it again in the same press conference.
I think you're confusing it with the
no,
president.
No, not the civilians.
No, you're talking about Herzog.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Talking about, you're confusing Katz to Herzog. Katz never corrected. He's now the defense minister,
Herzog
by the way.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough.
He's now the defense minister, by the way. And he said civilians that they will not receive a drop of water until they leave the world.
Okay,
No, these statements
again,
matter.
that was for I think it's less than 2 weeks, but if you want to say 2 weeks, that was the policy. It was for 2 weeks.
And what else was going on in that 2 weeks? The people who had the starvation strategy were also launching the most bloody month of bombing in the 21st century.
Matthew, do you think that the two things shouldn't have been going on at the same time, that they should have chosen either the quote-unquote starvation or the bombing? I'm not sure I understand that.
So I think here I'll put it this way. I think when Biden and Jack Lew and these guys went to Israel after October 7th, and they were talking about how we're going to block all food from coming into the population until we get the hostages back or they overthrow Hamas, they should have said, we're not going to give bombs because these people are willing to murder civilians. Like these guys, we're not going to support them militarily, as horrible as it is, as horrible as this terrorist attack they endured is, because they are committed to murdering civilians as a strategy. But so what the Biden administration instead did is they said, no, you have to let food in, right? And then Israel let food in. What they should have done is said, well, these people have murderous intentions. We can't trust them with our munitions. That's what I think.
So you would have preferred that it was harder for. I mean, I don't quite understand that. America has its national interests. I think its national interests are with Israel and not jihadist fanatics who just did October 7th. But I suppose we can disagree on that.
I think our national interest isn't to support murder, isn't to support the bloodiest bombing campaign in the 21st century. It isn't.
Okay, right,
I mean, Biden even yesterday said Netanyahu. He again used the term indiscriminate to describe the bombardment of Gaza. Biden again used this term in an interview with Lawrence O'Donnell, and he said Netanyahu was arguing with him we're talking about the early parts of the war, that Israel should be able to engage in quote carpet bombing because the U.S. did this in World War II. So
Biden also took credit for Israel, attacking, taking out Nasrallah. Biden says all kinds of things,
but we have a convergence of evidence, though. We just have a convergence of evidence. We have the murderous intentions regarding the starvation. We have the
murderous intentions that were then reversed within 2 weeks. Okay.
Why are they reversed, though? The U.S. coerced them. The starvation strategy was...
so there's no starvation.
No, there is
After
starvation.
a horrible attack, the response was, we're going to close our border, we're not going to let anything in.
Starvation quickly.
And you want to say, that's evidence of intention to kill innocent civilians. I think it was an intention to not feed the army that just attacked you. But okay.
Okay, they're still not feeding.
I just find it to be, I find this to be a kind of pedantry that is placing Israel under kind of microscope, where I don't think, if something like this happened in America and there was like a group of kind of Mexican terrorists who abducted like thousands of American citizens we were going to use kind of by scale and, killed tens of thousands of Americans. And the president of the United States and his cabinet said, we're going to close the border entirely. Nothing's going to get into Mexico.
And Mexican civilians will never have a drop of water. I can't imagine people saying,
wait a second, you have an intention to kill innocent Mexicans. Okay.
Yeah.
I just find it to be, again, I find it kind of sinister pedantry.
I mean, again, it's not just one issue, though. We have a convergence of evidence in favor of the thesis that something really horrific happened, whether it's the demographics of the dead, whether it's the Where's Daddy program, whether it's just the sheer number of civilians, women, children killed, whether it's these statements at the very beginning, whether it's what Biden said yesterday about Netanyahu was defending carpet bombing, and saying he did it in World War II.
I didn't see the interview. Biden has said a lot of things on both sides.
You can say he's lying or he's lying. But
I'm not saying it's lying. I'm accepting that
Okay.
that the nation was enraged after this horrible attack, and then it modified its policies.
Can I get Matthew to respond to that particular aspect of your argument, Eli, which is, I find interesting the distinction here between intent and action. We know a lot more about action than we do about intent. A lot of what's being said about intent, whether it's the intent of Hamas to induce a furious Israeli response that would kill its own citizens, and it wanted that for political purposes, that's speculative to opine about that. And likewise about the intent of the Israeli retaliatory response after October 7th, murderous intent, reckless disregard for civilian life. To some extent, that's based on speculation. But I want to ask Matthew to respond to the premise of, as I understand it, Eli's defense, which is PTSD after a horrific event led to intemperate responses, which are understandable under the circumstance and ought not to be judged outside of that context. And it's what do you expect if a similar thing had happened here on a scale comparable to what in the national context happened there? You can imagine the fury that would animate vitriol, that would animate the vengeance seeking and rage that would fuel an American response. Why should the Israelis be any different?
Yeah, I mean, I think whether we would react that way is a counterfactual. I hope we don't. We wouldn't. I think we wouldn't, but I don't know. So it's a counterfactual claim. Maybe it's true. I don't know.
I think
I'm quite sure we would. But
well,
go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, as a matter of fact, we did.
Regarding
After September 11, 2001, undertake a series of actions which, in retrospect, could be judged intemperate and excessive, which was certainly deleterious to the populations against which they were carried out.
I don't accept an equation of.
I didn't mean it as an equation. I just meant it as a comparable.
I'll only point to this point, though. I don't accept, because it's important, I don't accept empirically, as a matter of targeting practices, an equation between the United States bombing campaign in Afghanistan or Iraq and what Israel did in Gaza in October 2023. I think it's just a completely different magnitude. And also, after 9/11, President Bush didn't talk about human animals. He didn't talk about how the Afghan population shouldn't get in, which harbored the Taliban and has sympathy for extremist Islam, shouldn't get any food or water. There was not this level of dehumanization. I think we made terrible mistakes, that the Iraq war was thoroughly unjust. I don't accept that we engage in this level of depravity. In terms of the counterfactual, I don't know what would happen. That is a different counterfactual, right? I just don't know. But the moral question, which I think is more important than what we would do, whether we'd be better, is no, we should not dehumanize people based on the fact that they have the same ethnicity as a group that committed a horrific massacre against us. No, we should move beyond that as a species. There's no excuse for traumatization of this kind under the law of armed conflict. And the same excuse could be given for the Gazans who've been living in, I don't accept the concentration camp term that some use, because they weren't starving, before October 7th, but they've been under a siege for 17 years. They've been impoverished by this siege. If they were a country, they'd have the highest unemployment rate in the world. They've had periodic bombing campaigns by Israel that have killed a lot of civilians. So we can make excuses for either side. I think we just have to say, no, you cannot dehumanize and murder enemy civilians, and the fact that they're the same ethnic group as those who perpetrated this attack. I mean, like the majority of these people are either people who were against October 7th, and I don't think that's the majority, but there's a lot of people who think it was wrong, right, in Gaza, or children under 14. So, I mean, it just was not a rational decision to dehumanize people who, in the large majority, either thought this was wrong, what happened, or are young children.
Okay,
Matthew, do I take it that you think that, therefore, given the nature of all of this, that Israel should have gone after some high-ranking commanders, and sometimes that would be successful, sometimes not, but killed very few, maybe not none, very few civilians, in which case it's pretty clear that effort wouldn't really have changed much. Is your idea that basically Israel should have seen its hands as being tied in actually trying to prevent this happening again?
Well,
that's a genuine question.
Yeah, but not. I mean, they didn't. The problem is this war. They were destined to lose this war from the beginning because they didn't have. They had very poor intelligence in Gaza. They thought they could. They didn't even see October 7th coming, which is quite extraordinary, given that they were practicing for it in the open. Right? There were some women, actually, Israeli intelligence, who were giving warnings about this, but the general apparatus, the IDF, did not see this coming. The political leadership didn't see this coming, right? And they had very weak information about the tunnel system, which is their core infrastructure. So they ended up having this just wild massacre where, we think this guy's in Hamas, let's bomb him while he's in his home with his family and kill everybody. And it wasn't effective. So I reject the premise that, we're tying their hands. And what they did wasn't effective. And we're seeing that by the fact that they're calling it quits effectively. I think the ceasefire will hold. I think they failed to destroy Hamas. I think the war effort failed. So I just don't accept the premise of the question that this was necessary to win the war, because they didn't in fact win the war. And I think the big reason is
I didn't actually say it was necessary. I'm just saying, how would you have done it? Is really what I'm saying.
If I were Israel, I would have taken a deep breath after October 7th and avoided I hope I would have done this, right? I'm not saying I'm morally superior to anyone, but I think what they should have done is take a deep breath and try to develop a rational strategy. Try to develop a rational strategy as to how to counteract this threat from Hamas. And I think if they had done that, they'd have realized that October 7th was really a flukish event. It required cartoonish failures on the part of Israeli intelligence to not see, this teeny territory, not see as people practicing for the assault, right? I would have rooted out people in the government and the military who are dehumanizing the civilian population. I would have punished those who talked about killing civilians. And the IDF right now, there's a journalist, Yunus Tarawi. It's just rampant dehumanizing language, murderous language, genocidal language, and it goes unpunished. I would have rooted this kind of thing out. And this isn't just about the people of Gaza. This is in Israel's interest. I don't think this rampage and this murderous, or in some cases genocidal language from leadership has been in Israel's interest. And I would have conducted a more rational response, probably expanding a buffer zone in Gaza to prevent another October 7th from happening, and then dealing with Hamas as a political problem. Because I don't accept that they are an existential threat to Israel. I think it's absurd. They commit a horrible terrorist attack, but they're not an existential threat to Israel. There's no reason October 7th had to happen or has to happen again. Like, this is...
Well, I mean, the leaders of Hamas were saying they would do it again.
Okay, but what do they have? They have no air force. They have no anti-aircraft weaponry. They're like crude munitions. I mean, Israel has the United States and a very powerful air force. And the desire to do this on the part of Hamas doesn't equate with the reality.
Well, I guess a couple of things. On the murderous intent, a point I think that I said earlier, but should be repeated, is that counting against the murderous intent were all of the other mitigation factors, saving the
I want to talk about that,
roof knocks that Israel did when they did these bombing campaigns. So that was still a policy, which they did. They called people, they said, get out of this area. They provided, again, the routes to get out of areas. And that did happen in that period.
Yeah.
So that's the first point.
I want to talk about that. So
sure. Well, okay. Yeah. Fair enough. Go ahead.
Yeah. So with regard to warnings, there are two types of warnings. One are specific warnings, which clearly have a humanitarian motive. Like, and I'll get to that in a second. There was a really interesting story in the BBC about, it's kind of bone-chilling story where like an Israeli low-level commander calls and says, I'm calling, we're going to bomb your apartment in 2 hours. That's clearly, at least parsimoniously, we can assume that's a humanitarian motive. The general warnings to evacuate, like go south, when there's no humanitarian infrastructure to provide for people evacuating, where elderly people can just drop. These are clearly done for military reasons. They're not done for humanitarian reasons. And why would you do that for military reasons? It's the same reason they have this so-called generals plan right now in Gaza, where they were blocking food coming into northern Gaza, right? They wanted the people to get out, the civilians, so they could isolate the guerrillas, right? Hamas's strategy as a guerrilla group, like the Viet Cong, like the FLN, is we can't fight Israel head on. They're way too powerful. So we have to sneak around. We have to do hits and run. We have to do ambushes. Israel wants the civilians to get out because then it's easier to isolate these people. So it is a military motivated policy, the general evacuations. The specific and the general warnings, like go south, we are going to bomb your city, is not a humanitarian measure. Bashar al-Assad did this in Aleppo. He wasn't motivated by humanitarianism. He wanted to isolate and make it easier to target guerrillas. Now, if you're talking about specific warnings, those are clearly humanitarian. Why? Because you can just say, oh, we're going to bomb your city. Why would you call someone and say, oh, we're going to bomb your apartment? That's clearly humanitarian motive. My view, I can't prove this, but my view is that these are ad hoc decisions that were made by commanders. This is not Israeli policy in terms of the humanitarian warnings. They did happen, but they were rare at such a low scale that I think they were ad hoc decisions, and therefore Israeli policy cannot be credited. Only individual commanders can. The general warning
against that is Israeli policy. There is a process under which they do that. My understanding is that before they have to do this, they have to make certain kinds of warnings. I think it's a little bit of a distinction without a difference to say that they want to isolate the guerrillas. Yeah, that's a measure to save civilians. Of course they do. They want to kill the people who just did October 7th, and they want to not kill civilians. So that would be a point in my favor. And all of that, I think, is sort of, goes against your argument about murderous intent.
I don't think it does. So they had, for example, the so-called generals plan was developed to starve the population until they left northern Gaza, right? They wanted to isolate Hamas in northern Gaza so they could kill them legitimate tactic, but they were willing to starve the population to do it. This is widely reported, the so-called generals plan, and it led to a reintroduction of the starvation strategy in early October. That's why Biden and Blinken were complaining, wait, why are you blocking aid again? We said you cannot do this, right? So this really shows, I think, the generals plan that this is not humanitarian, the war. They want to just isolate the militants, and they want the people to leave. If the people go voluntarily, great. If we need to kill some or threaten them or say we're going to starve you to death if you don't leave, we'll do that too. So it's a military motive. Other militaries have done this who obviously don't have humanitarian motives. The example I gave in Aleppo is a really good one. The gray zone might say it's humanitarian. I don't. I think they were trying to isolate guerrillas. I think that's what Israel is doing here. In terms of, I'm calling you because your tower is about to be bombed, that's clearly humanitarian. It would be silly to pretend otherwise. There's no military reason for that.
Well, even the New York Times piece, which was very critical, said that Israel was doing that. They just weren't doing it.
No, they very rarely. No, very rarely. This is much rarer than in previous wars. Very rarely. I think they were ad hoc decisions. It wasn't pursuant to some kind of collateral. If there's a limit of collateral, there's some kind of collateral damage ceiling where you have to give a specific warning. I think these are just ad hoc decisions that commanders made. And in fact, it doesn't say it explicitly, but the BBC story I just referenced, it's really interesting, actually. I'm calling from Israeli intelligence. We have the order to bomb. You have 2 hours. I can't say it says that, but my interpretation is that the piece supports the idea that this was a decision the commander made. This wasn't policy.
Okay.
I mean, in fact,
my
Israel
understanding
has said
that
no
is
roof
policy
knocking.
and that the commanders do it because it's policy.
But why did they say no roof knocking? Why did they say that? Why did they say no roof knocking?
I actually don't know why they stopped the roof knocking. It could, but again, because of the other efforts that were made to try to get civilians out of areas where there were going to be heavy bombings, that augurs on my side of the debate, that there were efforts to try to mitigate this and try to, again, you're right, they were trying to isolate the guerrillas so they could get them and not have the civilian harm done. But that's what happened.
I'd like to ask Eli a question.
Yeah, sure.
I follow Peter Beinart.
Mm.
He's wringing his hands and fraught.
Yes.
I'm a colleague of Omer Bartov, the historian, who has announced that he thinks what Israel is perpetrating in Gaza amounts to genocide. He's an Israeli himself. I'm colleagues, not in the same institution, with two great economists, Ariel Rubinstein and Madi Perry, whose piece in Haaretz I happened to cross recently, which is also Beinart-esque in its hand-wringing about what's the atrocities, quote unquote, perpetrated by the IDF in the prosecution of the campaign in Gaza. And what I'm trying to ask about is the intra-Jewish conversation. If Matthew says that the war in its full effect will redound not to the interest of Israel in the long run, I assume a lot of that has to do with international opprobrium earned as a consequence of the conduct of the conflict by Israel. And the soul of the Jewish people, and forgive me, I'm not in a position to opine about that, but I know that people are opining about it, seems to be on the table here. And I just wonder how you would respond to that set of questions and those fellow Jewish intellectuals and journalists and academics who are wringing their hands in public and worried about the reputation of, if I may, your people.
Well, I mean, I would say that in the case of Peter Beinart, whose work I know the best, he began his career as a public intellectual as a Zionist, and I don't think he is a Zionist anymore. I think the majority of Jews in diaspora are Zionists. And I think it's fair to wring your hands after the war. I think it's fair to, I said this earlier, but I value, even though I disagree with where you're coming from on this question, I feel passionately about with Israel, I value someone as intelligent as yourself, exploring the other side. And in a sense, I suppose I kind of value Peter Beinart, although I have other issues with him. But I don't think it's really like I think it's a minority within diaspora that feels that way. And I'll cop to a prior. I think like many Jews in the world, October 7th was such a sort of bone-chilling event that I began to understand. I understood the war as a kind of an existential question. And I think that when you look at it like an existential war like that, and you realize that the survival of the safe haven for the Jewish people is on the line, which I think it was, I am willing to, in a situation like that, after you're attacked like that, to allow or to accept far more kind of harm to civilians than I would if it was just a sort of an abstract question. So, Peter Beinart and your colleague, Omar Bartov, I understand that they come at it from a different route. I do not think, though, that they really are speaking for that much of the broader Jewish diaspora. But at the same time, I will say that even on something I feel extremely passionate about and I disagree with them about, I'm grateful for intelligent people to make the arguments on the other side, because we all have our blind spots. So I hope that kind of makes sense. It's almost a Talmudic response, is to say, I'm grateful for the dialectic, even though I very, very much disagree that there is something that the Jewish people or the Jewish state should feel ashamed of here.
It makes sense, but it leaves me with questions. One of them I've already asked, which is, at the end of the day, now that we are entering into some fashion or another of ceasefire, and Hamas is still standing, my God, the carnage that has been wrought, the destruction, the devastation that has been wrought, one has to ask, was it worth it somehow if we're back to square one?
I don't know that
And the
we're
other
back to
question
square
that
one, though. I think you have to look at those other geopolitical factors. You have to look at
about
the fact
Iran
that
and Hezbollah and so on.
and also the leadership of the Sinwar is no more. Ahmed Deif is no more. The senior leadership of the people responsible for October 7th are gone.
But it's a festering wound that will presumably not go away and only reassert itself in the fullness of time, as has been the case in the past.
Perhaps.
The other question that I want to put to you, Eli, is as a distinction between American interest and Israel's interest on this issue of reputation. Israel's its existential conflict, it has to do what it has to do, and it's done it, and will take the hit. Would you see any credibility to an argument that, well, okay, that was Israel's hit, but that's not a hit necessarily that the United States has to take in terms of its geopolitical standing? And a little bit like asking allies to sign on to dropping Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. They might have said, you got to do what you got to do, but I would rather not have my name on it. What would you say to an American, perhaps someone like myself, who would concede the arguable necessity of Israel's actions, but nevertheless not want to be associated with them?
Well, I would say that one of the most important things in terms of America's reputation abroad is its alliances, and Israel is perceived as its ally. And I don't think there's any doubt that that the array of enemies that Israel was fighting were also despise America. So if the United States had restrained Israel, which I think is what you're getting at, or if the United States had said, okay, not in our name, we're not going to rearm you, and it had somehow hindered Israel's war efforts, I think that would be perceived. I think that would embolden America's enemies in the region. And I think it would cause doubts with other American allies that feel vulnerable to those same enemies. And I think it would have ripple effects. So I think it is in America's interest to have supported Israel. But let me just sort of, in the fairness to your point, the images, the civilian toll, the sort of moonscape that is now in Gaza, that is something that can engender a program, of course, from all kinds of places in the world, because we live in such a connected world. So I acknowledge that. But on this point, and again, this is kind of my speculation, and I'll acknowledge this is not based on data, based on a kind of sense of vibes that I love when you and John discuss kind of the moment we're in. Are we in a post-woke moment? I think what we saw on college campuses that began with kind of Hamas solidarity right after October 7th. So before Israel did anything, the statement from the Harvard postgraduate, whatever, the coalition of whoever they were, they said they hold Israel responsible for even October 7th. And this was the view of many on college campuses. Now, I see that sentiment as something that is very much, that is not a reflection of what I think most people in the West and most people in the United States think. And I also think that sentiment, and the intensity of the protests on campus that came right after October 7th, I think that that is very much kind of coded right now in our culture with a lot of the same kind of woke issues that excited, this crowd on other issues, whether it was after George Floyd or whether, for that matter, it was like, the kind of extreme climate action. So in that respect, I'm not as worried about this lingering effect about Israel and its international and its reputation, because I think the people who are kind of leading the charge of what I would call demonizing Israel, maybe you would disagree with that term, are the same people who were demonizing the police. They were the same people who were kind of demonizing America in the 1619 Project. And I just don't think that that's got much of a future. I think it's that hopefully that sentiment has run its course.
That is a comment about American politics
Yeah.
with which I could substantially agree. It doesn't address the question of the global community as International Criminal Court.
Fair enough. Okay, so on the global community point, it's nothing new for Israel. It's been treated as a pariah by international institutions for almost its entire existence. And at the same time, that sense of being a pariah has not stopped normalization between Israel and Egypt and Jordan and the countries of the Abraham Accords. And if we are to believe Senator Rubio's testimony this week before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, soon possibly even Saudi Arabia, which if you would have told that to David Ben-Gurion and the founders of Israel, they would have fainted, it seems, because they couldn't believe that a country like Saudi Arabia, which is the heart of Islam and the heart of the Arab world, would ever get to a point where they could accept Israel's existence. And yet I think that's probably coming, in the aftermath of this. So on the one hand, you're right. There will always be a certain type, especially in international institutions, especially within the kind of UN bureaucracy. There will always be kind of an NGO crowd that will find Israel to be demonic. On the other hand, that has not stopped this kind of march towards normalization if you look at the long trend.
I want to make a quick point about the international institutions.
Sure.
I would actually agree with Eli that the UN Human Rights Council, the UN General Assembly are biased against Israel. I just think, it's not really worth contesting that. But the number of institutions who are arrayed against Israel is impressive, and it cannot be glibly dismissed as, it's a bunch of Arab states in the UNGA, right? I mean, take the ICC. Karim Khan, which has indicted Netanyahu and Gallant for murder and starvation as a weapon of war, and is going to be investigating, incidentally, the bombing as well. All right, they're talking about the starvation, which we could talk about a bit. The starvation, because I don't think I fleshed out my view on that quite clearly, because it's in the middle of what the claims on both sides are. But the ICC, Karim Khan did not indict Israel, as many people wanted him to, in the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, for settlements, which are a clear war crime, right? The West Bank settlements, the violation of the Port Geneva Convention. But his view was, we keep our powder dry. We're not going to go after Israel or other states, for that matter, unless we're talking about extreme war crimes. Andrew Cayley, this was the chief military prosecutor in Britain for many years. There's another ICC prosecutors, a career Air Force veteran in the United States, and their lawyer. I'm one of the experts convened by Khan who agreed with the indictments for murder was Theodore Meron, who was a former judge on the panel for the prosecution of Milosevic and genocide in Yugoslavia, and also a Holocaust survivor himself. He was a slave laborer as a teenage boy. So these are, you cannot just go because they're all against this. No, there are a lot of institutions that have not been against you and now are because of the crimes that Israel has committed.
And I would just point out that the incoming president of the International Criminal Court has vocally opposed.
I'm talking about ICJ. I'm talking about ICC.
So, okay.
ICJ is part of the UN, though. The UN is...
Fine. I'm just... Okay.
Yeah.
And also the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction in Israel or, for that matter, America.
I'm sorry, Eli. What has the incoming president of the
ICJ has opposed the South African genocide prosecution. So it's an... I think she's an African woman, and I don't know her name off the top of my head, but she has vocally opposed it, and she is the incoming president of that court.
That's the ICJ, though. The ICC.
I said I agree. I'm correcting myself. It's the ICJ.
Right, but I would just say that and if you look at the experts that were impaneled to agree with the prosecution, then these are serious people. These aren't just like woke polemicists.
Well, I don't think it's I think that we already had this argument. I think that you had the 2 weeks of PTSD it did not amount to an actual policy, and that if you actually look at like the statistics, and not just from COGAT, but from other international experts, including I think the UN IPOC that measures famine, what they say is at least the stuff that's going in. Now, there are food distribution problems in Gaza that is a complicated, probably a whole other episode, but that is not the same thing as a deliberate strategy of starvation.
So let's
even
talk
though
about this
I
in more
think you're
detail.
right, it was discussed, or at least closing the border was if nothing will go in after, again, October 7th. I find that understandable. And I just point out that it did not become an actual policy. And I think there's only 41, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, Palestinians or Gazans who have died of malnutrition.
Okay, let's flesh this out a bit, because I didn't actually state my full position on this. So the claim of hundreds of thousands of deaths famine is not true, right? I think we agree. What I believe happened, and what the ICC believes happened, what these experts who are impaneled believe happened, and what the humanitarian aid workers on the ground over and over again believe happened. And I don't think this continued throughout the war. So I want to make that clear. But what I think happened for at least through February, right, was an attempt by Israel, a surreptitious attempt to obstruct aid by setting up red tape deliberately, to pursue, in other words, the policy of the first 2 weeks in a clandestine fashion. That's what I believe happened. And the evidence for that is all the testimony from the aid workers on the ground. Also, you talk about the COGAT data. Why did so much more food, vastly more food get in after this policy, in my view, ended in spring 2024 as before? Way less food was getting in February, for example, of 2024, in December of 2024. We have the aid workers on the ground. We talked about obstruction. We even have the United States State Department, the NSM-20, which said Israel did not fully cooperate with U.S. attempts.
Which was then corrected by the State Department, the Secretary.
No, so he corrected that Israel did not fully cooperate. That was the NSM-20.
I think he disavowed the report or something like that.
That's not accurate. Okay. They said that the State Department's position was Israel did not fully cooperate with attempts to provide food to the people of Gaza, but then now was, so that they changed. I think there was a change. I think food was getting in. And if you look at the starvation deaths that were reported, they were skyrocketing. They were going way up in February, March. We got dozens of deaths of children. More children died of starvation than died in October 7th. I don't think we should trivialize this crime. I think that Israel at some point probably came to their senses. The U.S. pressured them to. Biden in the State of the Union, said aid cannot be used as a means of leverage.
Do you, in terms of the food insecurity question, do you have any kind of calculation for the fact that we know that aid trucks were hijacked? We know that there were rockets that were fired on the humanitarian pier that the United States built. We know that we know that Hamas does have a policy of at least distributing the food, and they distribute it to their loyalists and their fighters. So it's a little bit more complicated than just sort of saying this was the result of some sort of policy of Israel, when inside of Gaza, there are these other factors that also contribute to the wider kind of food insecurity.
Of course,
do you not acknowledge that?
Obviously. Well, but again, though, this is, Israel would presumably, if they were engaged in this conspiracy that the ICC accused them of, and I accuse them of, I'm not accusing them of doing it in the summer, right? Last summer, right? I'm not. I don't think the data supports that. But I do accuse them of doing it in the first months of the war, of trying to slow aid, of putting up red tape deliberately as part of this attempt to provoke, to inflict suffering and try to coerce the end of the war and giving up the hostages and so on, that Israel would have known that there'd be distribution problems. And therefore, of course, there's going to be during a war. So yeah, I accept that, but I don't think it bears on the allegation. And in terms of the numbers who starved to death, while I do not think it ever rose to the level of famine, I think that the number reported by the Ministry of Health is an undercount. We have polling data suggesting 0.5% of, pretty robust polling data suggesting 0.5% of households had a child starve to death. I can't remember when this was through. It was through either March or April or May, maybe even June, but not through the entirety of the war.
Okay.
So I think that we're likely to have had hundreds of children starve to death. I think hundreds is a conservative estimate. It could be in the thousands, but I think hundreds we can say with some confidence based on the polling data. Although you're right that I think 40 have been identified with Israel-issued ID cards and so on by the Ministry of Health. That I think the number is larger, while certainly not rising level of famine. My hypothesis, IC, is correct. They had this starvation strategy explicitly the first 2 weeks. They tried to use it covertly. even our own State Department implies this. They don't say it outright, but they say they did not fully cooperate. What does that mean with attempts to give food to the civilian population? And now they are, right? They said they were later. I think they basically came to their senses and said, whoa, if we actually get a famine, this will destroy our war effort and reputation. And then they stopped obstructing. That's my interpretation. But I think they were obstructing for months and children starved to death as a result.
We're about to conclude.
Okay.
And I was going to invite you to make any concluding comment that you might want to make while thanking Matthew Cockerell and Eli Lake for their participation and observing that while you have a conversation like this, not because you think you're going to change anybody's mind, I don't think that was anticipated, and I can certainly see that that was not achieved, but also not so that you can have a shouting match and everybody can call everybody a name and point their finger, maybe a little bit of that, but not too much, but so that you can learn where other people are coming from and what the various arguments are, and be that in that way better informed about the debate. And I think we accomplished that. So again, I want to thank Eli, I want to thank Matthew, and I want to thank you, John, for hanging in there until the end.
No, that was not a problem. And I think what's very important here on this notoriously difficult issue, kind of do a quick look back at a conversation you and I had, Glenn, especially about a certain book, is that this isn't simple. There is no way to talk about this issue and say, all I know is. And to listen to two people making such comprehensive cases from such different positions is instructive. And notice nobody raised their voice and nobody left. That's the way it's supposed to go.
Okay, Ta-Nehisi Coates's talking about you.
I didn't really mean it that way.
Are you guys going to have him on the show? Are you guys going to have him on the show ever, I wonder?
We tried. He won't answer.
All right, guys, calling it a day. And again, many thanks.